Welcome to today's session. A small disclaimer here that we have to provide to everyone, mainly just to let you know that the views and the opinions expressed during today's webinar are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the official position of the Department of the Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. Next. And if for some reason there are any type of security issues that happen during today's session, we will immediately end it and a new join link will be sent out to everyone via email, just so we can avoid anything in the future. Next. All right, you can see here on the map, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen this map before, but it represents all of the technology transfer centers that are funded through SAMHSA. You can see the blue, the orange, and the green. The blue are the addiction technology transfer centers. The orange are the mental health ones, and the green are the prevention ones. We are Region 9 ourselves, and we cover California, Nevada, Arizona, and then you can see the small box we cover different territories and islands, such as the Hawaiian Islands, the Commonwealth of Northern America. Let me see. It is even so small that I can't even read it right now. But Micronesia, Marshall Islands, Guam, Palau, American Samoa. I believe I covered everything. But those are there. And even though you may not be in Region 9, you're always welcome to attend any of our sessions. But if you ever need assistance contacting one in your region, you can always reach out to us and we can help you with that. Okay, next. Okay, so our role is we offer a collaborative model to provide you with training and technical assistance, resource dissemination that supports the mental health workforce. And our goal is we always want to promote evidence-based, culturally appropriate mental health prevention, treatment, and recovery strategies so that providers and practitioners like you can start, strengthen, and sustain them effectively. Next. And we do this by the many services that we have available to you, no cost. As you can see on the wheel there, we offer a lot of different things. And once we're able to start traveling again, we will also offer more on-site training, conferences and assistance. Right now, most everything is virtual. And then if you would like some more customized training at the end of the session, we'll provide you with all of our contact information to do so. Next. And lastly, we use affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all of our activities. And as you can see, some of the items on the screen, we offer strengths-based and hopeful language, non-judgmental and avoiding assumptions, just to name a couple of them. Next. All right, so to get to the main part, I will let Kaethe Weingarten take it over and introduce herself and get to the most important part of today.
Okay, I have no conflict of interest, and I work with Migrant Clinicians Network with the Witness to Witness program, which I founded 3 years ago. This is just a little bit about my work, which you probably have seen already, or you wouldn't be at this webinar. But something exciting and very coincidental happened, which is a blog that MCN published today, which is called "It's Never Too Late to Soften Grief," was just published today. And Joanne is going to put that into the chat. So if you want to read it, it's short, but I think it's actually pretty helpful. So one of the things that people know who've taken either of the two previous webinars with me is that I use the chat a little bit differently than in a lot of webinars. My preference is that you not hold back from comments or questions until the end. I prefer that you do that as we go along, that you put comments and questions into the chat, The Q&A is really for more logistical, technical issues that Joanne will manage. But she's going to pass along comments that you have, questions that you have to me, and it's not an interruption. I am trying to be in community with you, and this is a tough topic. Now, I've designed this webinar so there is an arc. We're going to be talking about grief initially, but then moving towards resilience and compassion and reasonable hope, which is a construct that I developed about 20 years ago. And we're going to do this together. And, in the kind of the highest order construct that I might have about grief, I will say that I do think it is easier in community, and we are now a community. And so we're going to go through this material together. So some objectives: all grief is not the same. Grief in the time of COVID has very unique features. How children react to loss, and it is a topic that I'm going to be talking about. And then, as I said, we're going to talk about reasonable hope. So these are two quotes. If I can move this one. And again, I'm having a little bit of difficulty there. No, didn't do that. I'm trying to shift it so that I can actually see the entire quote. I'm going to be giving you two quotes at the beginning, and hopefully we'll get to the very end, and there'll be one at the end also. And I think these are quite profound. David Grossman's son died, and this is part of his process of making sense of that death. This is perhaps the greatest task, our life task, those who have experienced a loss like this, to learn how to go forward on the fabric that guards us against the fall abyssward, and to know there is no fabric that is guarding us, and even so, to go forward on it and to fall time after time, and even so, to go forward. And even amid the fall and within the abyss itself, to go. And another man whose son died writes this: he's talking about his family, "We have come to see that grief is not something you pass through, as there is no other side. For us, grief became a way of life, an approach to living, where we learn to yield to the uncertainty of the world, whilst maintaining a stance of defiance to its indifference. We surrendered to something over which we had no control, but which we refused to take lying down." And a very simple statement, and this comes from me: death reminds us of the incredible privilege of being alive. And I hope as we go through this together, we will hold on to that. So many of you, at least 40, have seen this slide, but now I'm really going to be focusing on the stage of disillusionment and reconstruction. And one of the things we know is that grief is profound in these two stages. In reconstruction, we have to adjust, we have to rebuild, and many, many people experience survivor guilt, and we're going to go through some of this. And the stage that I'm talking about, disillusionment from what, reconstruction from what, really has to do with what the pandemic wrought in our lives individually, as families, as colleagues, as people who work in institutions, and as a society as a whole. So this is the first question that I'm going to pose in the chat, and it's going to be very simple. I'm going to ask for a number. And this time the number is going to refer to the following. If you think about the last 18 months and how much turmoil it introduced into your life and your life as a worker, as a family member, as a member of a community, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is a lot, the most turmoil, how much turmoil has there been? So just a number from 1 to 10, and Joanne will read out those numbers to me.
All right, we got 10, 10, 7, 8, 9, 9, 7.5, 8, 10, 10, 7, 9, 7, 9, 100, 10, 10, 6. We got a 3 in there.
A 3. Okay. Wow, that's an interesting experience, an outlier. And there always is. People's experiences are not uniform, but the majority of you have commented, put a number in indicating that there's been a lot of turmoil. And for many of us, the turmoil has involved loss and grief in relation to those losses. So loss now, many people have lost jobs. We know there's been food and housing insecurity. We've lost friends, we've lost family, and people have lost the experience of themselves as healthy people. We've lost connections with our neighbors. And for many people, they have lost faith in leadership to keep them safe, as well as dealing with and having experiences of loss in the future. Like, what is the world going to be like in now and in the near future? So loss occurs in multiple ways. There are expected versus unexpected losses. There's loss that comes from natural causes or unnatural causes, like accidents that are kind of freak accidents. And then there's something called ambiguous loss. And I'm going to spend some time talking about ambiguous loss. So this is a term that was coined by Dr. Pauline Boss, who happens to be a colleague of mine, somebody I really care about. And she coined this term to cover 2 kinds of situations, both of which are experiences of ambiguous loss. In the first, the person is physically absent, but psychologically still present. So if someone's missing in action, in a war, missing due to a natural disaster, for instance, all the time that those people were waiting in Florida after the condominium had collapsed, they were having experience of ambiguous loss. Would the person be there or not? The second type is when a person is physically present, but they're no longer themselves. And if anyone has lived with or knows somebody who's had a form of dementia, you know how challenging that can be, that they're there, but they're not the person they were. Or if somebody had a traumatic brain injury, can happen. And Dr. Boss believes that ambiguous loss disrupts the normal processes of grieving. It confuses people and it makes it very hard to figure out what to do. So one of the things that we know, because there's been some research, is that there have been more severe and acute grief reactions after COVID-19 related bereavement compared to natural bereavement, although not compared to unnatural bereavement. And the reason has to do with, for most of the time, those deaths happened rapidly and they weren't expected. And that is a predictor. Those kinds of deaths, when it's sudden and not expected, is a predictor of prolonged grief disorder, which I will also talk about. Now, let me just say again that it any point in this presentation, because you have the slides, you're going to have the recording. If you're, starting to be upset or feeling that you're getting emotionally dysregulated, do something to ground yourself. Take a break, get yourself a glass of water, do some deep breathing. The material is going to be here. I'm going to be here. Grief's not going away, but we want you to be as comfortable as possible, which is not super comfortable, while we go through this material together. So there are 3 kinds of grief, and I put quotes around straightforward because what that is kind of implying is that normal grief is just straightforward and, not what's the big deal. Everybody is going to experience a death, a loss. And so, everyone's going to have to cope with grief. Yes, that's true. And I personally don't think that there's anything straightforward about anyone's response to any loss. There are 2 other kinds that many people really, don't have or haven't thought particularly about a category for a type of grief, disenfranchised grief. So I'm going to go into that and then also talk about grief, the kind of grief that happens if you've been estranged from someone. Well, what is that like? So disenfranchised grief, also sometimes called hidden grief or sorrow, refers to any kind of grief that goes unacknowledged or unvalidated by your community. And it's a kind of grief that where other people often minimize your experience or they just don't understand it. And when that happens, of course, mourning, your grief process is going to be more difficult. And my perspective and the perspective of, most grief people who are grief counselors who've studied grief is that all grief is valid. And, no one gets to tell you whether you should or shouldn't feel sad. So here's some categories that have been proposed for types of disenfranchised grief. So if for whatever reason you felt a need to keep your relationship private for someone, it may very well mean that people in your community don't recognize the relationship and therefore they don't really understand why you're so upset. Other losses, certain kinds of losses, some people will say, well, you broke up with that person or you were estranged from them, so what's the big deal? And yet for you, it may be a very big deal. There's certain losses, and we're going to be talking specifically about suicide, that are surrounded by stigma. And so the circumstances of your loss lead others to judge or criticize you. And that makes your grief more complicated. If you lose someone who wasn't a romantic partner or part of your immediate family, some people may not want you to or feel that you have a right to mourn them. That's somebody else's phone in my household and I can't do anything about it. I apologize. And sometimes grief doesn't align with social norms. So most societies have unofficial rules, you might say, about grief, including expectations about how people mourn their losses. And yours, the way you mourn, may not fit those social norms. And so that's another aspect of disenfranchised grief. So now I am going to put out another question in the chat. Just ask, how many people have had an experience of grief that would fit this category? Not necessarily just one of these 5, but something that you would identify as disenfranchised grief. So you can just put in a yes or a no. Yes, meaning, yes, I've had an experience of disenfranchised.
And we've had about 10 responses, all yeses, still rolling in, all yeses, and 1 no. Somebody said loss of pet, they didn't see it up there. More yeses, another no.
So pet is a really interesting point, because in some communities that's absolutely recognized as a situation that warrants deep mourning. And of course, there's some social situations where people go, it's a dog, you'll get another one. But it really does depend very much on the community you're in. So one aspect of ambiguous loss is that it also can be a form of disenfranchised grief when the losses are about what people had hoped to be doing on a daily basis that they cannot now do, and also fears that they have about their futures. So this is a category of ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief that is very particular to young people. Many people who are youth who graduated from high school or graduated from college or were moving to a new city for a job and they thought their life was going to unfold in a particular way, and it hasn't. And the pandemic has created conditions for many young people that fit this idea of a disenfranchised grief that's also about an ambiguous loss, because they didn't have something, it's just something they thought they were going to have, and then they didn't. So again, I'm going to ask, how many of you are aware of people, young people in particular, who would have this quality of disenfranchised grief, of life did not turn out in the last 18 months the way they had thought? So just yes, no, if you know somebody who fits this category.
Yes, lots of yeses, lots of yeses. Yes, 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 and one answer.
So one of the things that seems to be helpful is to use this category, the category of ambiguous loss plus disenfranchised grief, as a way of almost, like putting a container. The container is concepts, but a container around the experience, and acknowledging the challenges of ambiguity. And of course, encouraging them to admit that they're grieving for what, hopefully temporarily, yes, they are missing. Now, as I said, survivors of a suicide often feel that they suffer from disenfranchised grief. And I'm not going to go through all of the statistics, but I will say that there have been kind of contradictory analyses that have come out. Global analyses, some are saying that there isn't an increase in suicide, and then others are saying, yes, there has been. Some people are saying that the increase in overdose is actually suicide by overdose. And as we'll see, there have definitely been an increase in suicides of young people, quite an alarming increase. But the people who are left, often because of reasons of stigma, feel that they can't even talk about the reason. How many of you, and again, yes, no, have read an obituary and it says died unexpectedly? And that's a kind of a workaround, if you will, for not saying suicide. How many of you have read an obituary that says died unexpectedly, but you know that it was a suicide?
All yeses, tons of yeses. There's a no. Has read died at home.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah.
So there are many ways that people try to manage. And in most cultures, people living in the United States, it is actually something to manage because of the judgment and the stigma associated. Now, we can look here. This is a self-screening Mental Health America. They have been producing really excellent material during the pandemic and, of course, before. But you can see the increase in suicidal ideation. And I use the word stigma quite a number of times, but there's also a sense of shame. People isolate and feel confused in relation to it, and it clearly complicates the grief process. It's estimated that there are 6 or more suicide survivors when one person commits suicide. That's a lot. And it's a lot of grief that people are holding and are reluctant to or are embarrassed to share. And of course, it turns out that precisely because it's stigmatized, it's also difficult for people to know, well, what do I say to somebody whose loved one has committed suicide? So one of the things that I say is that it's really important not to let the fear of saying or doing the wrong thing keep you from reaching out. And just as you might after any other death, you can just express concern, ask if there are practical tasks you can help with, and just be there to listen. This is a set of 7 suggestions. Stay close. Survivors are so used to people being awkward, it doesn't really bother them as much as you might be embarrassed if you think you've said something. You want to avoid hollow reassurance. You want to share memories if you have them, acknowledge uncertainty. And again, helping with practical tasks is important, and not asking for an explanation. You're there to listen. And if you're a good friend, hopefully you're there for the long haul. So again, this was a study that was in the Lancet, and it's one of the ones that I was referring to when I said that globally, some of the research is saying that the pandemic has not produced an increase in suicide numbers in high income and upper middle income countries. On the other hand, also, as I said, suicide rates in young people aged 10 to 24 have increased 57% from 2007 to 2018. And we don't have data yet for the last 18 months, but the people who study these trends are saying that they think they are going to be dramatically higher. And one of the indicators has to do with the numbers of mental health visits and to emergency departments, and also the numbers of visits to emergency departments of young people, even in the age group of 5 to 12, with self-harming behavior. And we know that there's a wide variation in suicidality across different racial groups. And given that during the pandemic, at least so far, the rates of suicidality have been almost twice as great for African, American Indian, Alaska Native, Black, and Hispanic Latinx adults, we then know that more children are going to be left. So now I'm just going to pause for a moment, because we're going to go into a different category, grief after estrangement. But again, I'm just going to ask in the chat, yes, no. How many of you, either professionally or personally, have been in a position to console or having needed to be consoled because of knowing someone who had committed suicide? just a yes, no there.
Let's see, most of the answers are, well, I guess we're probably about a third no, 2/3 yes in responses. There's also
Okay.
a comment in there.
Yeah, please.
Another way to look at increased ER visits of young people during COVID is that they are reaching out.
Mm.
And
Yeah,
let's see.
that's a very nice frame. I mean, it's a useful frame.
And then we also had a question before we move on to the next type of grief, as someone asked, when people of color see racial violence, i.e. murder of Black people by police, and it goes unrecognized by people and environments around you, could that fall under disenfranchised grief?
Absolutely. And thank you. I mean, I think this is going to be in the chat, or certainly I'm going to be able to pick it up in the recording. So I'm not going to make a note of it. But yes, I think I would like to add that in as a category. So I very much appreciate that comment. So I'm going to take a deep breath here, and I encourage everybody to do that. And now I'm going to talk about another form of grief, which again, I mean, I think is something that is not spoken of as much, but clearly here is somebody who did research. It's one of the first books on estrangement. He interviewed 1,340 Americans, and 27% were estranged from a family member. And one of the things that he comments on is that when there is an estrangement, people feel ashamed of it. They're embarrassed, even if they're the ones who've chosen it. Adult children tend to be more commonly the people who have cut off from parents, and people with estranged relationships have more complicated grief and often have regrets. So he was interviewed, Carl Pillemer, a psychologist, was interviewed about his book in relation to the pandemic, since, people are dying, and especially before vaccines, older people were dying. And he was saying, what kind of advice would you give people who have estranged relationships? And he said, really think through how you're going to feel, anticipate regrets you're going to have. And even if there's an estrangement or has been for a while, think about whether actually you would feel better if you attempt a reconciling or a reaching out to the person from whom you're estranged, or whether, no, you're square, you're okay with how things are with that person. So now I'm going to turn to different kinds of reactions people have to loss. And again, these are categories that are in the grief literature. And as people who work with other people, as providers, it's important to know these categories. But certainly in my experience of the last 50 plus years as a clinician, I think that these are not definite categories. They're not cutoffs. I mean, yes, we're told that after 6 months, there's it's called diagnostically a prolonged grief disorder. After 12 months, persistent complex bereavement disorder. But, in my experience, the second year of grief is often more difficult than the first. And yes, that life goes on, life moves forward on almost like a parallel track. So these are some questions that are used for self-assessment for whether or not a person has persistent complex bereavement disorder. And I think they're useful. And at the same time, in my personal life, in my life as a clinician, I've had people 5 and 10 years after a death who would answer affirmatively to any of these questions. especially do you become easily irritable or agitated? Who doesn't? So let's just pause for a moment. And again, I'm going to say now, in your professional role, do you find it easy? So this is going to be a yes and. Do you find it easy to distinguish across acute grief and persistent complex bereavement disorder? Is that easy or more difficult? Easy, yes. Difficult, no. Just again, enter that into the chat.
We have a no, a couple of yeses, not always, no, few yeses, couple no's, yes, not all the time.
Okay, so we have a spread. People have different experiences and, probably also work with different populations. And that also may have something to do with it. So here's yet another way of thinking about or taking in ideas about grief. Where does it happen? Well, in my view, it happens as something in our minds, in our feelings, in our bodies for sure, in our spirits and our soul, but it also happens in our communities. And it is a tangled ball of emotions. It's all bunches and bunches of things. And the person, the biological influences, the psychological influences, the biological, the interpersonal networks that we're in, the spiritual communities that we're in, all of this has an impact on our experience of grief. But as I've said in other talks, our body is such a reliable barometer. It's such a good cue provider of what's happening for us. And so we can really learn on the basis of the sensations that we have in our body, what's going on for us, what we're feeling, what grief is like for us. And it's useful to kind of become aware of how your body signals you when you are feeling grief. And likewise, people have very different psychological experiences. So somebody might feel sadness, but somebody else might feel angry when they're grieving, or somebody might feel numb and somebody else might feel helpless. So again, people seem to have characteristic ways for their emotions to signal them that they're grieving. And it's, I think, very useful to know what they are. Grief is a stressor, and these are stress indicators. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the ways that when people are grieving, it shows up. Memory problems are a really common one, even in young people. Losing interest, apathy, can't get anything done. You just don't feel like yourself. These are all indicators that happen in a variety of situations where people are stressed, but absolutely in the context of grief. So very specifically, there are often disturbances of sleep, of appetite, of energy level, mood, and dreams. And about, I guess it's now 40 plus years ago, one of my closest friends' husband died, and he'd been ill with cancer for over a year. So it was not unexpected. And she called and told me that he had actually died. And I was quite a distance, and I was going to drive to see her. It was about 10 hours. And I not really thinking clearly, I said, have you been able to eat anything? And she said to me, you mean, have I been able to stop eating? So people are, some people lose their appetite, some people overeat. But the point is that there are disturbances when we are living with grief, not just acutely, but, over time. So again, I mean, some of this is pretty clear and something that but I do think it is worth repeating. Everyone's experience of grief is unique, and there's no right or wrong way to grieve. And grief consists of many kinds of feelings. It is that tangled ball. And even if other people have lost the same person, it doesn't mean that their grief is going to be the same as yours. So even if you are in a community, you're in a family where a loved person has died and other people are grieving that person, grief is often felt as a very lonely experience, even though other people are around. And oddly, the pandemic has one kind of unexpected, I think, side effect of the pandemic is because so many people have experienced loss that for some people it actually had made them, with their own private losses, feel less lonely. So I am going to ask in the chat, for how many of you would you say that your grief has been a situation, a context in which you felt lonely with it? But loneliness has been a component of it.
A lot of yeses at times. There's a no, very lonely, absolutely, yes, totally, absolutely, especially compared to non-healthcare providers during this pandemic. Depends.
So it's a kind of in some ways an unrecognized quality of the grief experience that is a strand, a theme that runs through the experience of grief for many people. Now, one of the things also that I like to say about grief is that it's the other side of love. And sometimes as a provider, saying this to somebody can really be helpful, that grief is a transform of love. And if the person you're working with or your family member kind of goes, oh, that's true, then there's some other ideas that follow. Grief is a feeling. Even when grief is very strong, it doesn't have to hurt us. Grief is the pain of loss, but if we didn't care, we wouldn't feel grief. And it is the case, and this is the case of so many of our feelings, that if we accept the intensity of our grief, it actually helps us bear it. And in my view, and this is absolutely not true for everybody, but it's true for a lot of people, that if we share grief, it also helps. So there are many, many ways of reacting to loss, and it's like a facet of a prism. So I'm going to ask you now, it's not just a yes, no, but if you could enter, what are some of your ways of responding to the pain of loss and grief?
Retreating, ignore it or try to stuff it down, withdrawing, isolation, retreating, isolation, Depends. Sometimes they are healthier than other times. Remembering fond memories and writing, feeling the feelings, thinking of the memories, laughing, crying, talking about it, crying, music, talking to loved ones, breathe through it, mindfulness, acceptance, praying, journaling, reading cards from the deceased.
So we have a range here, and it's kind of interesting. I don't know if it's, I don't know if it's also significant. I know it's interesting that the first responses were about withdrawal and isolation. And that's absolutely, one of the primary ways that people handle, we all have the kind of the image of you're hurt and you go like that. You're being self-protective. You feel vulnerable. You contract. And then, over time, for some people who withdraw and isolate, they're able to reach out. And for other people, that's just not going to happen. That's not going to be part of the way that they cope. So again, there are many, many ways to grieve, but there are some things that probably are helpful. So taking care of oneself, getting enough sleep, eating nutritious foods and exercising. I mean, that's good for everything. And it's certainly good for grief. Not being harsh with yourself when it's hard to do the things you need to do and want to do. And we're going to talk some about self-compassion here, because that's a really a big key of navigating grief. Finding ways of feeling connected to the person who died on a daily basis, if that makes you feel better. For some people, it just makes them feel worse, but not for everyone. And giving yourself moments when you allow yourself to imagine that nothing's changed. Of course, knowing that it has, but there's no harm in just for, a moment, imagining that the person is there with you. I have a very close friend whose husband died 6 years ago, and she maintains her bedtime routine. And she's not crazy. That's what she's done to console herself. There are huge cultural variations around grief. And just one that I'm mentioning here is that there are often different expectations for men and women, boys and girls. And for some people, that absolutely fits with the way they are going to go through grief. And for other people, their cultural traditions in this particular domain are not a very good fit. Also, people have, many people, most people perhaps have grown up with certain traditions, and some of them are difficult to maintain decades later. And so at times of grief, another layer of the grief is often the fact that you miss older traditions and you regret that those traditions are less available as sources of comfort. And finally, or not finally, but one other aspect of it is that not everybody is equally burdened by the experience of grief. And this was absolutely something that we heard all through the pandemic. There was one webinar that I gave, I think it was in April, maybe it was in May of 2020. And there were many people who were Spanish speaking in that webinar, and we had simultaneous translation. And one of the things that they said is that they felt that their loved one who'd been hospitalized hadn't gotten as good treatment as people who were English speaking and white. And they resented it. And it absolutely, they said, had complicated their experience of grief. So we've all heard, I'm sure, that it's important to let go of the person who's died. But I like to invert it and say, well, of course, the physical connection, the actual physical connection to a loved one, yes, that is going to stop. But the spiritual connection, the relational connection doesn't have to stop. And there are an infinite number of ways to feel connected to a person who's died. So I've just mentioned that my friend still maintains her same bedtime routine, but will listen to music that their loved ones listen to, or they think of them at a particular time of day, or they look at a photo, or they cook and eat foods that their loved one enjoyed. So again, the question in the chat would be, how do you stay connected to somebody you have loved who has died?
Someone made a comment. I think it's important to allow yourself to be happy after experiencing loss. Sometimes we get caught up in the heaviness of the grief and forget we have happy moments too. Allowing ourselves to experience joy is important. Let's see what else we have here. We have smells, hold on to the memories, music, pictures, food. Still talk to them because I know they're still with me. Memories, good times, speak their names, talk to them during prayer time, share their stories.
Yeah, so you all, this is a community that has many, many ways of staying connected and remembering that grief doesn't have to take up all the space, that it's absolutely possible to be sad, be grieving, be in mourning, and have moments of happiness, lightness, joy, pleasure, and that's really important. So every community has its own ways of honoring the dead, and cultures have them, families have them, and oftentimes we're able to adapt those customs to the present circumstances, even if it's hard to do. So, we're going to take a moment or so and consider what it has been like for many of us during the pandemic when someone has died. So overall, we would say that often our expectations were not met. We might have an expectation that we're going to be there, we're going to be helpful, we're going to be able to provide comfort, and we are going to be able to say goodbye. And for many of us, this did not happen during the pandemic. So how do we manage a different kind of dying and death? It could be quick. We may not have been with the person. We may have regrets, blame ourselves. We weren't able to say goodbye. As the person I mentioned, we may not believe, this certainly happened with me, that our loved one had the best care possible. We may not even be able to go through the normal burial rituals. I have a friend whose husband died right in the beginning. It's a year and a half, and they're planning the service now in August. It's going to be 19 months. And again, funerals and rituals of death will be different. So the question is, how can you create rituals of mourning that feel right? And here's some ideas. These are some things that people did. They connected through apps, through the internet, created activities that people could do by sharing photos. Faith communities have been incredibly innovative. And again, sort of the point here is, don't let what you can't do stop you from doing what you can do. So again, I'm just going to ask in the chat, how many of you on this call have had the experience of having modifications in your, what would have been your typical way of mourning someone you loved who died in the last 18 months? whether they died of COVID or not.
Someone said that they had a Zoom funeral and memorial. A lot of yeses.
So this was an aspect of the care and the situation that's been, very, very challenging for many of us, and personally and as family members, but then also as providers, consoling people under these incredibly unusual circumstances, often via Zoom. So I mentioned just very kind of briefly the estimates of bereaved children and how disproportionate it is affecting children of color. But the projected number of children experiencing a parent dying of COVID is somewhere between 37,000, 43,000 and rising. By comparison, in this paper, they said, there were 3,000 children who were left without a parent after September 11th. So this is, more than 10 times that. And again, the number is going up. So how are they bereaved? Well, they have lost primary caregivers, lost primary and secondary caregivers. And globally, what we're being told is more than 1.5 million children experience the death of their parents, custodial grandparents, or grandparents or kin who lived with them. And this was something that really surprised me. Overall, globally, or in the 21 countries that were in this study, 5 times more children had fathers who died than mothers. This is from a recent article that was in the Lancet. I'm just sort of pausing here to have this kind of sink in. It's staggering. And again, they're saying that for each person who dies of COVID, there are at least 9 newly bereaved. So this is an article that was in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 2018. And I'm not going to go through the categories, but what it's looking at is sort of the after effects of what happens to children who are bereaved. And the orange lines, which are sort of more of, and the green of children who are not bereaved. And you can see with almost no exception, rates of or prevalence of disorders and impairment are greater for bereaved than non-bereaved youths at different age points. So I am going to talk a little bit about children and death. And one of the things that we heard over and over again in our programming was how incredibly difficult it was for adults to tell a child that a loved one had died, especially when it was a sudden and unexpected death. And what adults said is that they were so broken up themselves, they just couldn't imagine being in the presence of their children a wreck. So one of the things that we have been saying to people is that when an adult cries or is sad, that doesn't have to be a problem for a child. Then we had some recommendations. And certainly one recommendation is that, when you tell a child, children are going to respond differently. Some children who are very concerned and want to ask a lot of questions. Other children react by as if, a wall goes down and it's not that they don't care, it's that they're absolutely not ready to take in the information. Some children approach for comfort and some children withdraw from comfort. And we heard that in responses today, that some people isolate and some people turn towards others. And well, children are the same. So just as it is for adults, living with death is a process for children. And we think that it is important to find ways of helping children not just let go, but also to stay connected. Of course, they need to feel loved and safe. And if it's possible to be in community, we also think that's helpful. And then here, I would say, kind of the bottom line is that even the most heartbroken child can recover, can grow, develop, and live a good life full of love and deep relationships. And I will also say, and this came out at one point in a webinar, somebody asked the question whether it was a good idea to lie to a child. And I thought about that and I realized that in 50 years plus of working as a clinician, I have actually never sat with an adult who said to me, I wish they had lied to me about so-and-so's death. I've many, many times sat with somebody who said, I wish they had told me the truth, but I have never, ever had anyone say to me, I wish they had lied to me so that I wouldn't have had to know that this person died. So I'm just going to pause there. So where is help available? So many places these days. And again, friends and family, their online webinars, their hotlines, their support groups, faith communities, nature, there are all kinds of resources. So where do you turn for help? And again, just putting into the chat.
We have counseling, friends and family, faith and family, online support groups, faith, family, nature, hospice organizations, friends, church, faith, friends, readings, professional
So again,
support.
a good range of resources you have. So, and for some reason this is okay. So now we're going to sort of move into the arc of, well, okay, what are some supports that allow us to be present to grief when it's happening and feel solid, grounded, that we have a foundation? And this is for those of you who are on previous webinars, you know that the Witness to Witness program is based on a model of witnessing. And the base of that model is that what we are trying to do is to move into a position of being empowered while we are aware. And often in the position of grief, we're very aware a death has happened, but we somehow feel helpless or disempowered in relation to it. So there are lots of ways, and it seems as though this is a community of people who have many, many resources for knowing what works for you, works for family members, work for clients, patients, to help them be both aware of their grief, but empowered in relation to it, as opposed to having to stay in numbness and even perhaps denying that a loss has happened. That tends not to be helpful. Alcohol use being one of the ways that we use denial. And these are, again, it's going to be in the slides, and you probably all are very familiar with steps to limit alcohol use. So I'm going to move into some ideas about resilience, and then we're going to talk about reasonable hope. So in a crisis, everyone has a strength. And this is not an exhaustive list, but I think it's really helpful to have a sense of, given who you are, like what is your kind of bottom line foundational strength? What do you turn to? What can you rely on? And again, if you can just put into the chat, what's your strength in a crisis? Grief is a crisis. So what is the strength that you can draw from? And these are just some examples.
We have holding space, faith, spirituality, faith, planning, good communication, faith, empathy, humor and love, planning and coordinating, holding space, being compassionate and present, being active, resiliency, family, perseverance.
Well, I'm glad I'm going to get the chat because these are wonderful examples. Thank you. So again, as you can, gather, if, you've been kind of hearing me throughout this, I really do believe that our effectiveness starts with our bodies. We do our best work and we're our best with our friends and family when we are in our resilient zone. And what that means is we don't want to be too hyper or too low key. And of course, good self-care keeps us in our resilient zone. Caveat, no one's resilient all of the time. That's not a useful thing to strive for. But it is, I think, useful to think about resilience as a zone. So we all go up and down in our resilient zone. But sometimes when there's a stressful event or traumatic event or a death, we can get stuck too high. And our thoughts are speedy, we're irritable, we're anxious. Other people get stuck too low, and their experience is that they just don't have any energy, they're depressed, they're numb. And then, of course, some people shift, and they're not, they go back and forth between being too high, being too low, but they're out of their resilient zone. So one of the things that I think is really important is to develop a resource list and literally write down what your go-to resources are. If you're somebody who gets hyper, you're going to want a list of calming things. So this one is calming. If you're hyper, you're going to want a list of things that will energize you. And if you go up and down, you want a mixed list. And literally writing down 3 or 4 things that you can do that are immediate, that are short, that work to help you re-regulate and get into your resilient zone is useful. As is self-compassion. So what is it? Well, I think it's like being your own best friend. It's being able to say to yourself what you would say to your best friend who's hurting. It's clearly seeing our own suffering. There's a genuine desire to alleviate it. And of course, a recognition that suffering is part of the human condition. And it works. It lowers arousal of the sympathetic nervous system. It increases the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system, which allows us to be calmer, but also then it helps us recruit our prefrontal brain, which is necessary for emotion regulation. So a lot of people have concerns about it. They say it's selfish. Well, no, it gives us resources to care. That it's really only about feeling sorry for yourself. I don't think so. I think it helps us feel connected to others who are suffering, and it actually reduces self-pity. It's hard to be nice all the time. Yeah, but it's really not, it's about reality. It's self-indulgent. It's kind of the same thing as being selfish. Well, it's not really self-indulgent because being self-compassionate is really for the long term. And other people will say, look, if you're not critical of yourself some of the time, you're never going to improve. But really what we want to do is be discerning and not harsh. And okay, are we going to lack motivation if we're not flagellating ourselves, being negative? No, I think actually it motivates us with care rather than with fear and shame. So research on self-compassion shows that it reduces depression, anxiety, and shame. It increases our happiness, reduces our comparing ourselves to other people, which is always a good thing. It's associated with healthier body image, and there's less disordered eating, and it reduces burnout, which is really important these days. Better physical health and immune function, better sleep. So how do we do it? Well, if you're able to be compassionate to other people, then you are going to be able to be compassionate to yourself. Owning a pet is very good practice, yoga. And then here are these 3 questions that I think are, that are sensible. How would I treat a friend in this situation? What do I need to comfort myself? And how do I care for myself already? And these sentences help. May I be kind to myself in this moment? May I accept this moment exactly as it is? May I accept myself exactly as I am in this moment? And may I give myself all the compassion I need? So now I am going to take a few moments on hope. And then we're going to take some time at the end for you to be able to fill out the evaluation, and Joanne will talk you through that. So obviously, hope is a feeling, but I also think that hope is something we do, preferably with others. So I contrast reasonable hope with rainbow hope, kind of pie in the sky. Reasonable hope is consistent with the meaning of the modifier, the word reasonable, and it suggests something that's sensible, that's moderate, and it directs our attention to what's within reach rather than what's desirable, but ultimately unattainable. So hope has as its objective the future. We're anticipating, we're hopeful about something to come. Whereas reasonable hope is really about making sense of the present moment in the now. It's a verb, it's what we do. It's not a noun. So we've been through a lot together. Thank you so very much for participating so well and with so much enthusiasm, even though it's a very challenging topic. And here are some really quick ways to feel better right away. So helping someone, setting a goal and planning for it, laughing, writing down 3 things you're grateful for, noticing something beautiful, can be 1 leaf, could be enough. Turns out that doing jumping jacks, even 10 jumping jacks, makes people feel better right away. It just completely changes our physiology. Napping, short naps are always great. And giving, getting, or watching a hug. So I am closing with a daily practice to restore equanimity. Again, this is on the PDF of the slides that you're going to get. Deep breath. Thank you so much for being with us on the webinar. And now I will turn it over to Joanne.
Thank you so much, Kaethe. As once again, wonderful, wonderful webinar and information that you're providing to everybody, and such an important topic that is happening right now. And as always, thank everyone for attending and providing your feedback and comments and questions that added to the interactivity of today's session. We really appreciate you being here. And lastly, here's all of our contact information. You can keep up with us on social media. We have a newsletter that you can request to be part of. Email us if you need customized technical assistance, or go to our website and learn more about the center or any of the centers in your region. So with that, again, Kaethe, we really appreciate you being with us again today and for the first two sessions that you held. We really appreciate all of the great information that you gave to us today. So thank you again, and thank you for everyone for taking the time out today to be part of it with us.